Welcome to this episode of the Raising Capital podcast and YouTube show. I'm your host, James Tuckerman. If you have not done so yet, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. And if you are listening to this or watching this on your phone, and if you have never given us a review, please take a moment to do just that. You'll be helping other people find our show, adding juice to the algorithm, and you'll be helping us more than you will ever know. This episode is proudly brought to you by the B2B-Podcast Network. If you are a B2B business owner, B2B-.io helps you automate over 90% of the client journey via one suite online platform. It's a funnel builder, a sales pipeline manager, and a CRM all in one. Use it to get more B2B clients and keep them forever. Now, today I have as my guest Gautam Mishra, who is the founder and CEO of Inkl. He has raised 5 rounds of capital from places like Commencer Capital and Amalfi Capital. And I want to start today's conversation with a question. Gautam, what was one part of the capital raising process that you thought would be easy, but was actually hard? Or what was one part of the process that you thought would be hard, but turned out to be relatively easy?
I think it's all been hard, actually. And this might be particular to us and the business we're building and where we're building it and the time in which we're building. There's a whole bunch of reasons, but I'd say capital raising has been the hardest part of building this company. And there's been lots of challenges with that journey.
Did you go in thinking it would be easier than it was and it turned out to be harder than it was?
Yeah, I did. I genuinely did because, from the outside, when you're hearing about companies raising money and what they have to do, and even when you speak to people who've raised money, you often hear about stories that are, well, not necessarily typical of the situation you find yourself in, or certainly that's what happened with us. So going into this, it always sort of sounded like, okay, we've got to get a couple of proof points and then we can raise a bit of money, or there was, particular goalposts. It's like, well, you have to get some publishers on board, or you have to get product shipped, or you have to get some revenue, you have to get some customers. But what we found was at each point, even though we crossed that threshold, we hit that proof point, we would just get presented with another one. And so it's sort of feeling like you're constantly chasing a rabbit, and every time you catch up to it, it just kind of scoots away again.
And we hear all these great stories. We hear about Canva and all these other ones getting these massive valuations for a proof of concept. And then you go out there and there are people that saying, no, I need to see that you've made some revenue. I need to see that you've done this. I need to see that you've done that. And the line in the sand keeps on shifting. So let's give everyone a little bit of an introduction to Inkl. What's it about? What's it do?
Sure. So Inkl is a news platform. We bring together paid news from sources like the New York Times, Financial Times, and Economist. There's over 100 paid sources that we provide access to with a single subscription. So $15 a month gets you about 250,000 articles from over 100 sources. We have journalists going through and finding the most important stories for you. We have machine learning trying to understand what you're looking for and showing the stories that are most important for you personally. And we try and give you a slightly different perspective on the news. So part of what we're doing is giving you a global lens. We're not just showing you the day-to-day, blow-by-blow of what Scott Morrison and Albanese are saying. We're showing you what's happening in other parts of the world. We're showing you news on crypto, on climate change, and a whole bunch of other topics that you won't necessarily see in the mainstream sort of day-to-day.
So it's a news aggregator, and I guess it's kind of like an online editor, because when we buy a magazine or when we buy a newspaper, there is an editorial crew and they decide what's going to go in it. You are doing that based on the user's own preferences, plus some machine learning, as you say, plus a little bit of human magic to make sure it's not all, I guess, feeding into your own biases all the time and you end up in your own little echo chamber. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's actually raising a really important point, because at the end of the day, the problem we're trying to solve for the consumer is that we're all trying to keep across more and more information every day. The information we need to keep track of is growing in volume, it's growing in speed, it's growing in complexity, and that's just going to keep happening. And so at some point, all of us start to feel overwhelmed, right? It's the whole idea of information overload. We've been talking about it for 20 years, and it's finally here. And the challenge is that, when people feel that way, they tend to respond by trying to find that solution in social media or search. But the algorithms that power social and search, they're trying to do different things. And so they end up creating these, as you were describing, these filter bubbles or these echo chambers. They bring in misinformation, they bring in clickbait. And so they're not really fit for purpose. And so what we're doing is we're creating essentially the world's first global tech service that is entirely focused on just making sure you're informed. We're not trying to sell you ads. We're not trying to make you, create virality, drive engagement, drive clicks, any of that kind of stuff. Our sole goal is just to make sure people are informed.
And you've done some pretty wild deals as well too. You've got brands like the New York Times. What are some of the other brands that you've got on the platform?
Yeah, so we've got a few different types of deals. So on the publisher side, so bringing the content together, the New York Times, the Financial Times, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Bloomberg, Reuters, Business Week, The Atlantic. We've got a lot of content that is not available anywhere else in the world. It's literally the only service in the world that, outside the New York Times own paywall, where you can access their content. And so we're very lucky to have been able to, find a model that works not only for the end consumer, but also ultimately works for the publishers. And so we've got content you can't get anywhere else. And then on the other distribution side, we've also been lucky to sign some really interesting partnerships with companies like Optus, who are starting to market and distribute Inkl subscriptions to their customers. Overseas, we work with Marriott and Hyatt and Hilton to provide news to their guests. In Australia, we work with universities like Deakin and with schools like Melbourne Grammar and Press Hill, and provide news to their students. So yeah, we've had a pretty good run of it.
So what came first, the deals or the capital?
The deals. Well, it's really interesting because we first thought that we'd get the deals and we'd get the capital, and so we went out and we got the deals. And getting these deals is really hard, right? You don't just rock up to the New York Times and get that content. And so I literally sort of backpacked across the US and sort of stayed in hostels and slept overnight in buses, trying to save money, and just stalked people at the pub where all the journalists and all the people from the newsroom go, and done some pretty crazy stuff to try and meet people up and down the chain and get these deals. And after 3-4 years, when we had enough critical mass, we kind of went back to a whole bunch of VCs and said, hey, we've got all this content. And then they said, well, but you've got to show us that you can build a really compelling product with it. And so then we went back and we did a lot of work on the UX and our algorithms. And we got to a point where, our consumer engagement metrics are probably in the top 1% to 2% globally. Like we look at daily to monthly user ratios, we're at 56%. People are spending about 9 hours a month on our app. The next closest competitor is about 4 hours a month. We've got people opening the app 4 times a day, 140 articles read. So we came up with all these second set of proof points on the product, and we went back to the VCs again and said, hey, we did that. We built the product. And then the VC said, well, you've got to show us that you can scale this thing. And so we said, okay, well, but we don't have any money to scale this. Like nobody knows we exist. We need to do some marketing. And they said, well, yeah, but you've got to show that you can scale it before we give you the money for the marketing. And so we said, okay, well, how do we grow this thing without any marketing money? And so we started figuring out, word of mouth and some of these distribution partnerships I was talking about. And so at every point, as I was saying, it's sort of like the goalpost change, right? And it's like, well, you've got 100 customers, you need 1,000, you get 1,000, you need 5,000, and sort of the goalposts just keep shifting.
One thing that I will say about entrepreneurs and the really proactive, go-getting entrepreneurs that have been around for a long time, decades in some cases, is that they handle constraints really well. The universe turns around and says, here's a constraint. Like, we want to see how you can scale it, but you've got no money for marketing. So that's a constraint. And then the entrepreneur goes, well, I don't have resources, so I'm just going to have to be resourceful. And then you do a deal with Optus where they distribute the product for you, and there's another workaround. But let's get to back to capital raising. Now, I believe that you've raised 5 rounds. What was the first round and who was it with?
So the first round was $250,000, and it was just a few high net worths. The principal sort of group in there was a guy I got introduced to who was a former editor of the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. And this was just online. And I said, hey, I'm going to be in New York. And I had in DC, he lives in DC. I had no plans to be in DC, but I just wanted to see if he'd take a meeting. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll meet you. And so I bought a ticket to DC and I went over there. And then I tried to meet as many people at the various publishers as I could. And this guy, Marcus Broccoli, he had been the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal. Then he was the managing editor of the Washington Post. And he had just left that and he was setting up his own VC fund. And he'd had an idea for a product like Inkl. And so I explained to him, what I had done. I was coming off of just setting up and running the paywalls for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. So I sort of knew a bit of what I was talking about with the problems for publishers and problems for consumers. And he had a couple of mates that he was setting up this fund with. So he said, okay, look, we'll give you $100K. Go see what you can do with it. And by that point, I had the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fairfax and News lined up already. And so I said, I can build a minimum
product. Contract or just a handshake, or they're just
it was at that point it was kind of it was emails and verbal agreement. It was kind of like,
you can get this together, we'll back you.
Yeah, exactly. And so I got the publishers on board
to see you ever again.
yeah, exactly. And it's really funny, right? Because that was kind of almost a universal experience in the first couple of years. I would tell people what I was doing, and then they would very politely try to change the topic because they're like, this guy is clearly insane. He thinks people are going to pay for news. Has he seen the internet? And, I don't know why I'm even talking to this guy.
Yeah. So that first $100,000, which became $250,000, which was high net worths, what did you have to show that those first original investors, those angels?
Content deals and a product. So at first I thought it would be just the content deals.
So you had a product, you had something to show them?
Yeah. So I basically put 30 grand of my own money into getting a couple of guys off of Upwork to go and build a prototype. And, it was janky as you could believe, but it worked. And what we did was we actually gave it to 100 people that we knew. And we said, look, we built this thing. There's a newsletter and there's an app. Actually, it wasn't even an app, it was a website. And we said, just see if you like it. And what we did was we left it with them for 6 months because we said, look, they're our friends and family. So the first couple of weeks, everyone's going to support us and, they'll use it. What we want to know is whether they're still using it at the end of 6 months. Because if they are, they're either a really, really good friend or we've actually built something that's actually useful here. And what we found was that we'd actually stumbled across something really interesting where people started to use this every day. And we could see even in those very early days, even with just 4 publishers, people were opening the email and looking at the articles. And so we took that data and the fact that we had these 4 publishers on board, and that's what we spoke to Marcus and his couple of friends about. And that's how we got the first $250,000.
Cool. Then how long before the second round? And was that also angels and high net worths, or was it that point that you started to get interest from the formal VC industry? So
the second round was in 2015, and we started by going through the Innovation Bay pitch night. So we won the Innovation Bay pitch nights. We got a bit of interest out of that. And everyone sort of coalesced around this one fund, and kind of the idea was this fund was going to do all the DD and they were going to do all the work, and everyone was kind of coming on the back of that. They're going to construct the round for us. And the fund did all of that, and they kind of did all the DD, and kind of, we spent probably 6 months working with them. And so then
what fund was that? Innovation Bay?
No, it wasn't Innovation Bay. Innovation Bay actually did the pitch night. The fund was one of the funds that was there on the pitch night.
Okay.
And so we spent 6 months with these guys, going through everything, explaining everything. I flew over to see them, 5 times. And at the end of it, randomly one Friday afternoon, I get a call saying they've decided not to do it. And they just, a couple of the guys are going to Europe for something, and another guy just kind of randomly changed his mind. And so they decided, sorry, but we're just not going to do it. And when they pulled out, everybody else who was going to coalesce around them also obviously pulled out. And so at that point, I had $5,000 in the bank. And I was just sort of, panic stricken, thinking, oh, well, that's it. That's the end. And, how am I going to do this? And luckily for us, an angel investor kind of stepped in. He was someone who had come in as part of the $250,000. And it was someone I'd worked with in my previous job. And he was an entrepreneur. He knew what it was like. He understood, and we'd worked together reasonably closely. And so he said, okay, I'll give you another 50 grand. keep the lights on, go see if you can find some more money. And so then we ran around and hustled, and we found another sort of syndicate sort of group of angel investors, and they gave us all told. Ultimately, we ended up bringing in $1 million. But yeah, it was a pretty rough year, 2015.
So how did you end up speaking to Commencer Capital and Amalfi Capital? And I'm assuming that there is probably rounds 4 and 5.
So Amalfi actually came in 2017. And I'd known Paul and Tristan, who are the principals of Amalfi Capital. So Paul was always interested in Inkl. I know Paul through my wife originally, but he was a journalist. And so he understood what we were doing. And Tristan was a very experienced VC who had, she was an early sort of employee at Skype. She ran biz dev for Skype in North America. She'd been at DFJ and Allens and Buckridge. And so the two of them understood what we were doing, and they kind of, went through all the numbers and things. And so they came in, and at the same time they came in, we got an interesting syndicate of basically hedge fund guys. Because what I found was really interesting about the hedge fund investors they were not as thematically driven. The thing I started running into with VCs was there were a couple of reasons why we just couldn't get anywhere, right? One was we were in a news sector, which is not typically where VCs like to invest, right? Because there's this perception, probably justified, that news is kind of old school. It's kind of, a bit dated. It's got a lot of problems, right? And if you're a VC and you've got like brand spanking shiny new things you can put your money into, agri-tech, ed tech, space tech, food tech, all that kind of stuff, why would you put your money into news, right? So we ran into a lot of people with this sector kind of objection. And the second issue was that, particularly in Australia, a lot of these VCs would say to us, well, show us where this worked. Right? Because you've got this Netflix for news idea. Okay, conceptually, I get it, but show me where it's worked. Because if it's working in the States and you're bringing it to Australia, okay, sure, it's a no-brainer. But my entire point was that, no, we're doing this globally. We're going to change this globally. This is like a huge opportunity because no one else has done it. And that was just a hard pitch in Australia. So what we found instead was when we spoke to hedge funds like Amalfi Capital, like some of these guys over in Hong Kong and Singapore, they didn't actually come to it from a sector perspective. They said, actually, just run me through all your numbers. Explain to me exactly how this business is going to work. And I'd spend, like, with some of these guys, like I remember there was a Goldman Sachs partner who was running a hedge fund in Hong Kong. I spent 8 hours with him, right? And the level of questions and the depth, I feel like the guy knows the news industry as well as I do now, just from the quality of the questions. And so they were the ones who came in that 2017 round. And that was another $1 million.
And so that was 2017, and that was round 4, was it? And then you've had another placement since then to top it up as well to keep things going.
Yeah. And so Commencer came in this round that we did earlier this year. They led the round. And they're essentially, like, Amalfi is sort of an institutional investor, but they're not a traditional VC. They're more of a hedge fund. They do some private placements. But Commencer is, more sort of standard venture capital model, sort of, and so they're our first VC fund.
You mentioned before, you said Netflix for news. Now that's a really classic example of an elevator pitch. Sometimes called a schema, because we use two things and we pull them together. I think the best one was that I ever heard was Aliens. When they pitched Aliens, they said Jaws in space. People like, oh, yeah, I get it.
Awesome.
How important was it when you went out to speak to these people that you'd have a nailed down narrative and pitch deck and all those different things? Is that something that was easy or hard? Is it something that they took seriously? Did you use that to get in the door?
It's a really interesting question, because I think there's two ways to answer this question. One is, you're absolutely right. Getting the language and the narrative is super important. And I would say to you that we actually still don't have it, right? I have a couple of elements of it. Like, I can say Netflix for news and you kind of get it instantly. I can give you a one-line spiel like I did at the start of the show. But when you start to think about the whole messaging matrix and how you explain this, what's the 2-minute version, what's the 5-minute, what's the 20-minute version? How do you change that for publishers and partners and employees and investors? There's quite a lot of complexity, and it is quite a hard challenge. And I'd say, like most startups, we probably didn't realize the importance of doing some of that upfront. We kind of struggled with it, and kind of put band-aids around a lot of that. But the other thing I realized was that where, the biggest issues for us, and I think this is perhaps useful for other startups, is to understand why people are saying no. And for us, most people were saying no, not because of our numbers, not because of our team, not because of the way the product worked, not because of, the downstream things. It was because they actually didn't buy the thesis, right? Because they just didn't want to invest in news, or they didn't think people would pay for news, right? And so what we eventually realized is, and I started changing the conversations I have with investors and say, I'm not going to bother you with my numbers. My numbers are awesome. I'm not going to tell you about my qualifications because I'm qualified to build this business. I just want to talk to you about what we're trying to solve. Because if you don't agree with me on the problem I'm trying to solve, there's no point talking about the solution. And for a lot of people, they just don't think that's a problem that needs to be solved, or they don't think that's a problem that they necessarily want to back. And that's perfectly fine, right? But it just makes the conversations a lot more efficient, because if someone doesn't buy the problem you're trying to solve, you're never going to get them to invest.
I hear this again and again. It's almost like a process. You have to get the narrative right. Well, it is a process. It's the narrative right. Then there's the process of going out and doing the connections. Then there's the objection handling, which then feeds into the narrative, which then feeds into the process, which then feeds into the objection handling. Did you have much of a process when it came to this idea of opening doors and engaging with these people, or were you just seizing on opportunities and contacts and luck where they presented themselves?
It's a bit of both, because you can have a bit of a system on how you want to approach these guys, and it's changing now. But certainly, for the first 4 or 5 years, like 2015 to 2020, the prevailing way to approach a VC was they wouldn't take a cold approach, right? They'd make you as an entrepreneur do the work and go and find a connection. And to be really honest, this really shits me. Right? Because it's like, man, I've got a million things to do. I've got a business to build. All you have to do is screen your calls, right? You don't want to take the call, don't take the call. You don't want to take the meeting, don't take the meeting. But to make me run around and try and find connections and waste like 5 hours to try and find a way to get to you because you're too busy to screen your inbox, like, what the hell's wrong with you? But that literally used to be the way the VCs would work, right? So you just kind of run around wasting all your time trying to find a connection, trying to get an intro through someone. And it's like, just stop all that nonsense. Check your email. You want to make a decision whether you want to meet or not.
Right.
And so I think they've actually got that now, right? A lot of VCs have come out now and said, actually, that whole approach was really founder unfriendly. And now here's an email. We will check every email. We will check every page. And the other thing is, I think they've also got a lot better at just saying no. Because a lot of these investors early on, they had a lot of FOMO, right? And they're like, oh, if I say no now and then you become a really big thing, then I'm going to look silly. So they just kind of ghost you, right? And they don't say yes, they don't say no, they don't say anything. They kind of, ask you for more information. It's like, oh, can you give me this analysis? Or can you give me a couple of slides on this? Or can you answer these 10 questions? And then you get nothing out of it. And so I think they've stopped doing a lot of that, which allows us as founders to be a lot more systematic. Because the problem is, when you're going through that journey, you go into the whole thing with a plan. And it's like, the Muhammad Ali quote, right? Like everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? And when you hit one of these objections, it's like, oh, all my plans gone out the window because I'm running around trying to deal with this kind of weird sort of bespoke request or requirement that I've got. If you don't have to do that, then you can actually be a lot more systematic. And what I would say is, we look at investors who are investing. So we're looking at people who have recently raised funds because they've got capital they're looking to deploy. We look at announcements of startups they funded. Where there is a thesis, it's really easy for us to say, okay, thematically, are these guys going to fit or not? Again, we find there's a big difference between Australia and the US in this, because in the US, the market is big enough that both for the founders and the investors, they can focus. And so you'll have specialty B2B SaaS investors, you'll have media investors, you'll have fintech investors. In Australia, the market's too small. So you'll have people kind of randomly taking some punts. And if you look at their portfolios, you'll see this, right? It's like you got some deep tech, you've got some space tech, you've got some consumer retail, you've got weird algorithm thing, right? And that creates a little bit of confusion, because that just means as a founder, you end up having a lot more conversations that are lower quality and less likely to lead to an outcome. So if you can, you try and short circuit that.
You said something a moment ago that I want to come back to. And you said it's useful if you're finding funds that are currently investing or have recently invested in the type of thing that you are. I'm sure that there are times where you got a connection or a door opens and you grab that door and you put your foot inside and you jump in. But that systematic process of identifying who's investing in what, how do you go about managing that piece of the puzzle to identify who's investing in what now, so that you can be a little bit more focused in who you want to spend your time?
It's literally just a spreadsheet, right? So it's just a spreadsheet. You start by just literally making a list of as many VCs as you can. And there's the Avcal registry here in Australia. I mean, frankly, it's not a long list here in Australia, right? Like you can do it in an afternoon. You could probably go around and see everyone in an afternoon, right? But if you're doing this globally, it's a much more complicated process. And there are sort of companies with databases and things. Like there's a community in the UK called Supernode Global, and within that community there is a spreadsheet that's out there that has various investors in media tech, for instance, right, all over the world. But if you're just doing this in Australia, you go to the Avcal registry, you can really quickly, like you go and read, Startup Smart and things like that. You can build a reasonably comprehensive list within a week and just put it all into a spreadsheet and just sort of say, okay, well, how much have these guys raised? When did they raise the fund? Because what most of these guys will do is they'll need to reserve, a portion of their fund for follow-on investments. So if you see that someone's raised $100 million fund and they've already deployed 60, 70 million bucks, it's going to be a harder pitch, as opposed to someone who's just raised a $65 million fund and hasn't made any investments out of it. They're actively looking to deploy cash, right? Because nobody needs the cash just sitting around, that you're not going to get returns off of that. So when someone raises a fund, there's a real urgency for them to go and deploy that cash, and that's probably the best candidate. But if someone has invested in your sector, I'd say that's awesome, right? Then you just and if you can get a warm connect, like with Commencer, we were speaking to a company they had invested in, and really amazing company, by the way. It's called Longtail UX. Really interesting for e-commerce vendors because they help you get a lot more traffic through search. And so Will, the CEO there, we were talking to him about what we're doing. And he said, you know what, we've raised money from Commencer. They're really good guys. Why don't you go and talk to them? And that's how we got in touch with them.
We were joking before about how they made it very hard, how often VCs make it very hard for you to connect. And I think that the mindset was, these are entrepreneurs and we want to make sure that they've got the entrepreneurial juice. And so what we'll do is we'll make them dance a little bit harder to come and connect with us. Now it's not so much the case anymore, but it's still a big chunk of the case. You mentioned that you got your connection through Commencer through someone that they'd invested in. What are some of the ways that you used to break down that wall or engage with the people that didn't necessarily make it easy for you?
Honestly, I don't think it's worth wasting time on that, right? I would suggest, like, for anybody, it's like if someone is making it really hard for you to even meet them, you're very unlikely to get a return on your time, right? If they're not, like, if you send them an initial note and you say, hey, this is what I'm doing, and their eyes don't immediately light up and they're like, this sounds awesome, when can we meet? You're pushing a rock up hills, right? So what I started doing now is I just, winnow very quickly. And it's like, I'll tell you what I do. And if you're interested, I'm going to get a note back from you and you'll want to set up a meeting. And if I don't get that, I'm not chasing after you.
So
right?
Email,
because chasing people doesn't work.
Email, LinkedIn, phone, what's the deal?
Yeah, any of that. LinkedIn I found is actually really good. People, especially investors, they'll respond to LinkedIn. Quite often, but they'll also kind of, like, VCs can be strange, right? Like, they'll do things like they'll follow you on Twitter, or they'll connect with you on LinkedIn, right? And so, but they'll do that sometimes for random reasons, not because they want to invest. And so, I spend a lot of time kind of, combing through my accounts on Twitter and LinkedIn, kind of seeing who's following me, and I'd reach out to them. But now it's typically just, if I want to speak to someone, I'll just say, hey, saw this about you. And it'll typically be something around, a news announcement, because that's why they do all this PR, right? Is to build their deal flow. And so it kind of works for them because they've put the story into the press because they want to get more funders contacting them. And so we'll just say, okay, well, that's how we got to you.
And then you've got a dialed in email that or LinkedIn message that you send to them that's got the enough information to get them on the hook, but not so much that they don't want to have a meeting with you.
Yeah. And again, there's really interesting sort of different approaches here, right? Because a lot of these guys, they'll ask you for a pitch deck. They're like, oh, I'm really busy. Why don't you send me a pitch deck? And then I'll decide whether I want to meet you. And my response is, hey, man, if you're so busy that you can't even decide whether you want to meet me after hearing about the business, I'm not sending you my pitch deck. I'm sorry, but I'm just not, right? Because at the end of the day, there is an asymmetry in power. But what you have to realize is you're building a business partnership, right? And you have to say, is this someone I actually want to be a business partner with? And if it's someone who's so lazy that they can't even bother to take a meeting with you, or they're so busy they can't take a meeting with you, is that someone you actually want to be in business with, right? And if I'll send you an email, I'll give you a snapshot of what the business is. I'll give you some salient metrics so that you can decide whether this is or isn't the right stage for us to talk. Like I'll talk about our revenue, I'll talk about our growth, I'll talk about our opportunity, right? And at that point, like, it's really up to the investor to say, okay, I think this is interesting enough that I want to meet this person, or they're going to ask for a whole bunch more information. And usually when they do that, I just say, you know what, forget it. Because honestly, when you get that, the other interesting test is to see if they follow up, right?
Yeah.
If someone asks you for a bunch of information and they don't even follow up, they don't really want that information. They don't even really want to meet you. Like, I mean, it helps them if you go and tell them a whole bunch of things that you know, but it's not going to help you. So I try not to waste time with, leads that just aren't going to work.
So I want to wind up on something that's a little bit of a tricky area, and that is valuation, because valuations are just so rubbery. And, at the beginning, it's highly subjective. You've got an idea of how much the business is worth. They've got an idea. How did you go about trying to bring some objectivity into the valuation, particularly at the early days when you're dealing with angels and you don't want to you don't want to give up too much, and you don't want to undervalue it, but you don't want to value it too high because that's going to make the future rounds more difficult.
There are benchmarks, right? I mean, you can just look at industry benchmarks. Again, most of these come out of the States. And one of the challenges in applying that information from the States to Australia is the valuations in Australia are much lower. But there are standard industry reports that come out of the US where you can look at seed stage valuations, angel, Series A, Series B. That's one way to do it, right? The second way, which I think is actually the better way to do it, is to actually just say, how much money do you need to raise? Because when you're raising money because you've come up with a plan. You come up with a plan saying, I need X million dollars because I'm going to do A, B, and C, right? And so you work backwards from X, right? And you say, I'm going to raise X, but I'm typically going to want to do this and sell 20% of the business. Because if you're, to your point, if you're selling 30, 40% of the business, especially in early stages, the problem you'll have is that by the time you're speaking to a Series B or Series C investor, they will look at your cap table and say, you own too little of the business as a founder. And so that makes them really nervous for the later stage investors. So if you sort of say in these early rounds, you really want to sell maybe 20% of the business and you need a certain dollar sum money, then that just tells you what valuation you need to do it at. The problem is in Australia, the valuations are a lot lower. And in Australia, there's sort of a two-speed economy for startups, right? There are some startups that are just rocket ships. And, Canva, Mr. Yum, Linktree, there's a few of these, right? And if you're a rocket ship, you can command whatever valuation you want because you've got the Australian investors, you've got the US investors, you've got everybody after you. And you basically are choosing which investor you want to work with. So you name your price, right? For everybody else, it's really more a function of whether you can construct the round. Because if you go in looking for $3 million and you get your $3 million, then you've got your valuation. Where you run into trouble with valuations is if you say, I'm going to raise $3 million on a 15 million valuation, and you can only find about $1 million. Then you say, okay, well, do I make do with $1 million and change my plan? Or do I try and lower the valuation to try and draw in more money? And then you kind of end up with messy sort of valuation stuff.
Yeah, wow. Really, really interesting. I'm glad we ended on that because that also leaves us with a lot of good stuff to think about. But before we go, I want to let listeners know that you can go to inkl.com/Tuckerman. Yes, that is indeed my last name, inkl.com/Tuckerman for a 33% discount on an annual Inkl subscription. So it's normally $150. If you can go there, use that link, you can get access to the world's best coverage for an entire year for $99. And if you want to amortize that over 12 months, divide $99 by 12, I don't know, what's that? Is it like, it's like $8 or something? $8 a month?
$8.25, yeah.
$8.25 a month. That is an absolute bargain. If you're out there running your own business, raising capital, I think it's worthwhile just doing it to support Gautam and discover this wild, new, amazing online tool called Inkl.com/Tuckerman. Thank you, Gautam Mishra. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, James.